In this episode, the featured film takes the viewer back to the last days of the Wild West, showcases the acting talents of a bunch of very tough dudes, and explores the themes of friendship, loyalty, and love. These stories and more from the 22nd row. The Wild Bunch was released in 1969. It is both a Western and action. A Western to the core, and an action film maybe like no other action film has been filmed up to that time in 1969. The film follows a group of tough guys, really tough guys, who are nearing the end of their wayward careers. The West was dying by this point, the West that they knew. The West of outlaws and robbing trains and banks, but they have to do something, and the only thing they know how to do is to steal. The time period for this film is curious in that it is 1913, which is odd for a Western because the West was just about done by this time, which I think makes for a very interesting film because this movie is about a bunch of guys who see that the end is near but have nothing else to do but what they know best. Now, the Western, of course, is a pure Hollywood vehicle. Hollywood had been filming Westerns for 50, almost 60 years, and they were very proud of the fact that they invented this medium, because, of course, a Western means the Western U.S. from whatever the Western U.S. and They told the stories of a life between the end of the Civil War, 1865, and about the turn of the century, so let's say roughly 1900. So typically a Western might be in the 1880s. A very famous event in the 1880s was in 1881, which was the Battle of the OK Corral, with such famous people as Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, and Bat Masterson. But our film is not set in 1881 or any time in the 1880s when this Wild West was flourishing in this case, Tombstone, Arizona. The film also could have been set about 10 years earlier in the 1870s when the U.S. Army was involved in a genocidal war against Native Americans. And there was a very famous event in this decade which took place, I believe, in 1876. Which involved the Sioux tribe absolutely destroying a command of someone called George Armstrong Custer. Now, it's odd that this particular event and the 10 years or maybe 20 years or so of this war against Native Americans, there would be very few Army heroes or Army characters of note other than Custer. But on the Native American side, there were many famous tribesmen who would be remembered throughout history. Crazy Horse, Cochise, Sitting Bull, Geronimo, amongst many, many more. So that's an ironic element to what was otherwise a very sad affair. But our movie is not set in the 1870s when this war was raging. And as I said, not set in the 1880s. It is set in 1913. Now, typically the Westerns that Hollywood produced, and as I said, there are dozens upon dozens upon dozens of terrific Hollywood Westerns, would have been set between 1865, which was the end of the Civil War, and around 1900, 1890, 1900, maybe 1905, when the world of the West was dying because of the Eastern populace expanding through the West, settlers, and institutions and railroads, such that the West was no longer wild, was no longer lawless. It became what we now know as the United States from coast to coast. So the choice of 1913, I think, is terrific because even though the Western has its structure, and the structure here is the same as all Westerns, it can avoid cliches because this is a story about a dying period in history with people who are not ready to leave it. Now, 1913 saw airplanes, saw cars. These things were still in their infancy, but were prevalent, at least in the east of the US, and were known to people in the West, although the horse still reigned supreme, certainly in our film. Also, there was a revolution going on in Mexico between Pancho Villa and the federal government, and that plays an important role in our story as well, because the location of the film is the Texas-Mexico border, where our gang of individuals are located, and they dip into Mexico and back up to the US when they need to get away from the US government, who are not particularly happy about the fact that they have been robbing trains and robbing banks for many, many years. So the time frame is important. It works in the film, and the Wild Bunch is going to tell a story about that period in time and these individuals, and who are now out of place in this modern world, at least modern for 1913. So here we are in 1913 with a bunch of tough dudes who are doing what they do best. And there's a word I've always liked. I don't like who they are, but I like the word. And that word is outlaws, people who live outside the law. And that word absolutely describes who these guys are. And they're very good at what they do. They rob trains, they rob banks, they move around on horseback, they live by a code of being tough, doing what they have to do to survive, which is to find money and take it. But because these outlaws are good at what they do, they are known to the US government, to whatever police forces existed at the time, certainly the US Army, and there is a price on their head, a very steep price for the main actors of this gang. So they are counting the days when they can no longer do what they do, because the government is just getting better at protecting the money and the outlaws are getting older. This Wild Bunch has a leader who has a track record. The only way a leader of a group like this can lead is that he must be experienced, he must have respect, and he must have done what he's done for many, many years. And that is definitely the case in our film. He has a best friend. He might even have two best friends, but one important best friend. And the gang has other members who agree to band together because the reality is that they are probably more successful as a group of individuals doing these robberies than they are as just one at a time individuals. But our leader is aware that their days are numbered. The world is changing around them. They can't change. And he says very early on in the film is that we've got to figure out how to live beyond our guns, because that's how they've lived for 30 years or so, let's say, and they have been very good at it, but that world is coming to an end. So right at the beginning of the film, we have to see this group in action. We have to see, okay, who are these guys? Are they good at what they do? And what kind of tough dudes are they? And that's what the movie does. Very quickly on, there is a huge action scene, very typical of a Western, but more so. And it is, for my way of thinking, a tremendous way to begin any film, because it builds nicely. Even though it happens within the first 5 minutes of the film, it builds up so perfectly. It's so well done, and it almost surprises us by how quickly this scene of relative calm and order turns into absolute chaos. I find it just brilliant. They try to rob something. Whether or not they succeed, that's for the movie to tell us. So after the robbery scene, they have to head back to a safe haven, and they meet up with one of their members who has been watching the horses and waiting for their return. And it's at this point where the story starts. We've had one terrific action scene, which is very important for an action movie, but the story starts now when our leader, our grizzled tough hero, realizes that they can't keep doing this, so they got to think of something else. But none of the members of this group can come up with a good idea of what to do. The only thing they can do is get away from the danger of the army, who is going to be pursuing them, and or bounty hunters who are hired by the railroad, who is really unhappy with these guys, to track them down and bring them to justice. So what do? They have to cross the border into Mexico and hang out. One of the members of this gang, the newest member, is a young Mexican who is probably there because he wants to acquire the skills necessary to fight effectively and defend his village, and at the same time make some money. So they head south and they regroup in his village and try to figure out what their next move is. And the timeline of 1913 is important. In Mexico, there was a revolution happening at this time between Pancho Villa and the Mexican government. So there was a war going on. What better place for outlaws to hang out and maybe do their thing when people are shooting at each other on a relatively regular basis? The other element is that in 1913, the world was just 1 year away from the Great War, which would begin in 1914. And the Wild Bunch movie does touch upon this just a little bit when they acknowledge that there are now airplanes, that there are automobiles, and that a war is coming. So it really was a time of flux. But what this meant was that the story can touch upon these elements, can show that these guys are desperate to survive, and that the technology and what they're exposed to is changing such that it's going to be much more difficult for them to do what they've done for 30 or 35 years. So the story of the Wild Bunch takes us through this journey of these men who have to find a way to keep going. It turns out they do find a way, becoming involved with the war that is taking place in Mexico. And ultimately, as they do what they have to do, they reach a crossroads where perhaps they think that there are no more scores to be had, no more banks or trains to rob, and they've got to do something. And so even though there are bits and pieces of action during this period of the film, the end of the film is a bit of a curtain call for the world they've lived in and who they are. And it is one of the most talked about action scenes, not only in Western films, but in all films. And it is something to see. It kind of comes out of nowhere, and it is jaw-dropping. Well, we have this sweeping story, a story over about 2 hours and 30 minutes. We have a really tough bunch of dudes who are the focal point of this story. Yes, we see the good guys, the members of the railroad bounty hunters who have to pursue them. We see some army personnel who are also victims of this gang. We see some of the rebels in the Mexican War, and we see the government body, the federales as they're called, which is the Mexican army. They also see them. So there's a lot going on in this film, and we have an ensemble cast. In this movie, we see the world through many different eyes, and of course, as tough as it is to write a good film with one character dominating, I think it's equally tough to write a film where there are many characters and everything has to be balanced, everything has to work together. We can't lose the momentum of the film, and we have to be able to identify the characters that are in play. And once again, that's why I say how important casting is to a good film. And to turn that around, whenever I find a film that I like a lot, I realize that the casting was terrific. So we have our hero, our leader of this Wild Bunch. His name is Pike Bishop. Great name, to be sure. And he's a grizzled, aging veteran of this fight. He's a tough guy, but he's a thinker. He's the brains behind the group. He puts together the jobs that they try to do to rob from the trains and the banks, but we never see it. There are no flashbacks to robberies. There are flashbacks for other reasons to give us a sense of who this guy is and who his friends are, but there's no other robberies in the film other than what we see at the beginning of the movie and later on. So this character is critical to the success of the film. He's our star. And that character is played by an actor, William Holden. Now, he was a huge star in the 1950s, in that golden decade of the golden age of Hollywood. Young, big, good-looking as only the Hollywood crowd can make. Terrific actor, and he made several films in the 50s, 3 of which I like very much. And starting in 1953, he made a film called Stalag 17, or he was the star of that film. That was a World War II prison film. Then he made Sabrina, with Audrey Hepburn, who we saw in an earlier episode in Roman Holiday, which is charming, fun, has a really great story. He is part of an ensemble in that group with both Hepburn and an actor named Humphrey Bogart, who we've seen in The Maltese Falcon. But then in 1957, he made a big budget epic film in which he starred, again with quite an ensemble cast, called The Bridge on the River Kwai. And that was a World War II, again, sort of a, well, definitely a prison film taking place in the South Pacific, and the bad guys are the Japanese. Well, this was a huge film at the time. As I said, big budget, did very, very well. And Holden, who was not a dumb guy at all, was able to make a lot of money on this film because he took a percentage of the gross in addition to whatever salary he was paid. It made him a multi-millionaire, which was great for Holden, great for us who watched the movie, but not so good for his career because his interest in movies kind of lagged after that. In addition to that, he also liked to drink, and that had some wear and tear on his body, such that the few movies he made in the 60s were kind of unexceptional. At least I didn't see anything of his that I liked very much until 1969 and The Wild Bunch. The right movie for the right actor at the right time. Now, his best friend in this film is a big Dutchman, and his nickname is Dutch, and that's what he's called in the film. And it's important when casting works well and you have an ensemble cast that the viewer doesn't get confused by who is who. So you can't have two actors who look similar. The casting has to be such that you have to pick characters to play these roles who define these characters as being different from everybody else. That's absolutely crucial. And whenever you see a film where you're saying, okay, which one is that guy? It's very difficult to enjoy the story of the movie. This is not the case in The Wild Bunch. Our number two, Pike's best friend, is called Dutch, and he was played by a actor named Ernest Borgnine. He was a very tough guy, but he again had started his film career in the 50s as a young man, had made some terrific films. Marty is one that comes to mind. From Here to Eternity, a great World War II film that comes to mind, and he played a very tough dude in that film. And once again, it was the right role for the right actor at the right time. He was similar in age to William Holden, probably early 40s, mid 40s, I'm not exactly sure, but he wasn't a young man. Extremely tough right-hand guy, and I mean tough. Sadly, Holden died relatively young. He would have one great film in the 70s called Network, but after that it kind of petered out pretty quickly, and he died quite young. Ernest Borgnine, on the other hand, lived to be 95 and had many good films in the 70s and 80s, and in fact appeared in one of the movies I've already talked about, Gattaca, which I believe was his last film. So Borgnine had a long career, made a lot of movies, television shows, did very well for himself. The other two actors I want to mention in this film are the other two of the three members of the gang. These two were brothers, and so it's important that, okay, whether they look alike or not, who cares? But again, they had to be very different from Dutch, and they had to be very different from Pike Bishop, the leader. They were a little bit younger. One of the brothers was a little bit younger. One of them was about the same age as Pike Bishop. Let's talk about him first. His name was Ben Johnson. He has a really strange name in this movie. Tector Gorch. Go figure. His brother, younger, a little crazier, not too bright, but also tough as nails because they're both in this gang, and they're in this gang for a reason. Not afraid to use a gun. They take orders, but they don't like it much at times, and there's a lot of infighting. The person who played this character is Warren Oates. This movie really did a lot for his career, and he had a tremendous run in the 70s with lots of really good films. He did a second film with this director of The Wild Bunch that's called Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, which is a great title for a movie, and you know I like titles, and that's as good as it gets. No two characters are the same, and that's what makes casting work. Now this is an ensemble cast, so there are many other players. There's at least a couple more members in the bunch. There's the general of the army. We don't see any of the rebels other than the young Mexican who's in the Wild Bunch, mostly. There are no women to speak of in this movie. There is a woman in a very small role who has an important element to the development of the plot, and which causes a lot of problems for the guys, but it's very minor. Then there is the posse who are chasing down our bad guys, our outlaws. And there are many Hollywood pros in this posse. If we think about two stars, maybe three, but I'd say two major stars and probably a dozen co-stars, that's a really tough balancing act. Causes that balancing act to be successful, again and again I will say, is the script. The Wild Bunch looks as good today as it did when it was released in 1969. Incredibly, 55 years ago. That's so hard for me to process. It's a modern film. It is a Western. A Western, even though it takes place in the dying days of the Wild West, it is still a Western film, but it is very modern looking when you look at all the Western films made by Hollywood. That doesn't mean those other films are bad. There are many terrific films made in the 40s and 50s, and I've talked about one of them, The Searchers, which are terrific Hollywood films, terrific Westerns, terrific stories. But The Wild Bunch, I think, is a terrific entry for viewers who've not seen a Western, and not seen a Western from long ago. There are still Western movies being made today, but they are nothing like what was made in the 40s and 50s. And there is no Western, I think, that has been made like The Wild Bunch in 1969. So why does it have the look and the feel it does? And I always exercise caution when I say this, but I believe the director of this film had as much to do with the look and feel of this movie as anyone. And his name was Sam Peckinpah. What a great name, Sam Peckinpah. He had a reputation for being a very difficult director. He was not a big fan of authority, so he had trouble with his producers and the studios. But he was such a disciplinarian and a lover of films that he wanted to make the films exactly the way he saw them without anyone getting involved or telling him to do something he didn't want to do. But I think this was Peckinpah's movie. So even though there may have been innovations in this film in 1969 and telling a Western story that had never been told in this particular way before, that doesn't really matter to modern viewers. They don't particularly care about that. But what is interesting is how this movie was made, how this story was told, this terrific story. And I believe in this case, having seen a few of Peckinpah's films, I think it comes down to the director. Let's start with the opening credits. And as I've said many times, sometimes the credits of movies are fantastic and unforgettable, and other times, in very, very good movies, you barely notice them. But in this case, the credits are spectacular. The opening credits are unique for its time, but they used stop action and colorization to begin the film. These always entertain. And I will say, which I don't try not to do too much, there's an inside joke at the beginning of these credits. So there is a stop action and a black and white element switching to color in these credits, which is, you just have to see them to enjoy them. And when the lead actors are identified, William Holden as Pike Bishop, Ernest Borgnine as Dutch, the film freezes and we see their faces. Now I did look this up, and it's something, like I say, I don't particularly like to dwell on, but it's worth looking up if you're interested in those sorts of things, that the third listed actor in the film, a very good actor named Robert Ryan, who had a huge career right from the 40s through to the late 70s, if not beyond, was not happy about his billing. And he apparently complained about that a lot. So when you watch the opening credits, watch how his name, Robert Ryan, is listed in the opening credits. It's an inside joke. It's kind of funny. You might miss it if you're not looking for it. And I certainly didn't notice it the first few times I saw this film, but after I heard this story and watched, it is pretty funny. And it certainly is Sam Peckinpah getting even with this actor who caused him a bit of trouble. The director always wins in the end. The opening scene, which is very controlled, does not let on for right up until the last second that something is going to happen here that the audience is just not expecting. We don't know that these guys are outlaws at the start. But that means that within 5 minutes of the film, let's say 10 minutes, we do know who they are thanks to this opening action sequence. The use of slow motion, the use of horses, who let's hope that none of the horses were injured in these scenes, because there's a lot of things going on with these horses and the people riding them, and the use of gunplay. This is a violent film, sort of, but it isn't like some films which are gory. I would say this is not a gory, violent film. There is a use of exploding bullets, or the explosions that happen to the body when a bullet hits it, that was, I think, at the time unique to this film. But the combination of slow motion and what happens when a bullet strikes a body, and it is startling for some, perhaps gory, but I don't particularly think so, but it is brilliantly executed and lends to the next element of this film. It's not a casting element, but a co-star of this film is definitely the gun. Again, was it the case that Sam Peckinpah was light guns, had grown up with guns? There may be something to that. There's lots of fun stories about Peckinpah and his revolver in the editing suites of his movies. But there's no question that the gun plays a role in this movie. All kinds of guns. Revolvers, shotguns, .45s, even a machine gun, again, given the time. It was a relatively new invention, although there had been rapid fire guns before, but the machine gun itself was relatively new. And for fun, grenades. Now what makes these guns a co-star is that they all sound different. And I think this attention to detail is another element that elevates this film. The revolver, the 6-shooter, has a certain sound to it. The Colt .45, which if the film takes place in 1913, makes perfect sense because the Colt .45 wasn't invented until 1911. And in fact, it's often been regarded as the 1911 Colt .45. And there's reference in the film to the fact that this weapon is very new and it actually isn't even available to the general public. But it sounds very different from a revolver. Of course, a shotgun sounds different than any other weapon, such as a rifle, and of course a machine gun. So when you watch this film and the amount of gunplay, and the gunplay is in moments, very particular moments. In fact, probably not much more than 4 scenes in the entire film involve gunplay. They sure pack a punch. There was a love of this and of the gun, and it comes out near the end of the film, and I'll just leave it there because it says that many people at this era, and certainly in the Wild West, they were identified by the weapon they used. And that weapon, just maybe like their horse, was very particular to these individuals. And it's nicely shown in a very subtle way near the end of the film. The other element of this film, the look and feel of the film, oddly enough, is not the soundtrack. Now, it doesn't mean the soundtrack is bad. I kind of like it, but it is almost invisible, with the exception of a wonderful scene early on in the film where the outlaws are taking a break in a village and pondering their next move. Now, I saw The Wild Bunch on a TV screen the first few times I saw it, but at some point, I don't know how long ago, the film was remastered and the infamous director's cut came out, so it was a little bit longer than the theatrical release. And I know I saw that film in a theater. I think it was, whether it was a repertory theater or the film had been reissued for a couple of weeks or something, I don't remember. But like all films should be seen, I saw it in a theater and it was just a joyous experience. And you really appreciated the photography of this film, where the camera was for the shots in the action scenes, how the camera lovingly describes the village that they rest up in, and the local populace, the Mexican peasants who lived in this village. The horses, again, a man on a horse or anyone on a horse looks pretty good cinematically. I think it was just wonderful, and I was very fortunate that I did see this film many, many years, probably 20 years after it was released, in a theater. And I remember it clearly, and especially the moment when on horseback they are leaving this little village. After that, there are other scenes which are very well thought of and have been spoken about since this movie was released, and they are the action scenes. And they are spectacular. They were a big deal at the time of the film, for whatever that's worth. But that's one of the reasons I think the film stands up today. It just looks terrific and shot so well. And then, of course, we have the action scene at the beginning of the movie that sets the tone for the film, identifies the characters. Tell us what this movie sort of is going to be about. It's going to be about a whole lot more than just that action scene, but it tells us something. And then at the end of the film, when our friends decide there's something they got to do, and there's a very long action scene at the end of the film, which has been talked about incessantly since the movie was released, and many filmmakers to this day still talk about the ending to The Wild Bunch. But I think it's because of the build-up to that moment, because the movie is shot so well, because it tells such a terrific story, that it just leads up to these moments where the camera takes over the storytelling, where the songs, the folk songs of the Mexican peasants take over the airwaves, the sound of the guns, the sound of the horses' hooves in various parts of the film. It all comes together brilliantly and to create that look and feel. And I have to believe, for whatever it's worth, it's probably the result of the director Sam Peckinpah. So that was Sam Peckinpah. He didn't live too long, but he had a number of excellent films and has a terrific reputation in the world of Hollywood. Now, a well-written, nuanced story never disappoints, and our Western The Wild Bunch is exactly that. There are the necessary action sequences, lots of horses, lots of running around, but there's also some themes to this story which are emphasized ever so slightly throughout the movie. And the first one, of course, is friendship. When you have a film about a bunch of guys, it doesn't work too well if they hate each other all the time. There could be infighting, as there is in this movie. There could be threats of violence amongst them, which defines their characters somewhat as the story continues. But there's also friendship between our two main characters, Pike Bishop, the leader of this bunch, and Dutch, who is his best friend. Now, we never see how they came together. All we know is that they are friends, good friends. And in fact, we see that Dutch, who is Pike's right-hand man, is as loyal as it comes, and he will never leave his side, and he will never let him down. And we see this time and again throughout the movie, but in very subtle ways. Just a look in their eyes, very few words spoken. It's just so subtly done, and it works so well. But at the end of the film, in this action scene that takes place, something else happens which really puts a stamp on their relationship. And after I saw the film a few times, I realized that The Wild Bunch is many, many things, but one of the things it is a love story. And that's a love story between Pike Bishop and Dutch. It is in a platonic sense. It is more than friendship. And I don't know if anyone's experienced that, but there are friendships, terrific friendships, and there is this inability to separate yourself from your best friend. And I believe this theme is central in the movie, and it is executed brilliantly. Another theme in this film is loyalty. The whole notion of a bunch of nasty fellows, independent, antisocial, who do not like authority, how can they come together for a common purpose? Well, part of that is because they have a common purpose, but it's also because they respect a certain kind of individual who is somewhat like them. Tough guy, fearless, good with a gun, has the same desire to make money any way they can. And that's critical to a bunch, as they say in the movie, sticking together or falling apart and everything being over. And our gang is very different individuals, very, very different, but they find a way to keep it together, which says a lot about loyalty. The other element, which I haven't said too much about, is the posse is led by a fellow who was a former member of the gang and was a friend of our hero, Pike Bishop. There are flashbacks in the movie to indicate why these two were friends and what happened, and it does have a comment on loyalty or perhaps betrayal. Even though some of them are critical of this once partner now turned a pursuer, the movie shows that there's a reason why this loyalty was put to the test and how this particular character has to do what he has to do. Again, a nuanced element to the story. Didn't have to be there. He could have just been the evil head of the posse chasing down the bad guys, but there's so much more than that going on, and it's executed brilliantly. Consistent with all this, I believe, is the final theme of this film, which I think is absolutely intriguing, and that is the joy of these characters. They are a dying breed. They are nasty, no two ways about it, but there is a joy to them. Our friend the Wild Bunch doesn't hesitate to show them happy, laughing uncontrollably 3 or 4 times in the film, usually laughing at each other. And this theme is throughout the film. They laugh uproariously. It seems odd given that there's circumstances where they are being hounded, where they are always under the threat of either the Mexican army or the posse or the US Army, and the threat is quite real because they can end up very dead. But at the same time, these outlaws, as the story tells us, are living the life they want to lead, and the movie does a tremendous job of showing that they can be joyful within this framework of doing what they want to do. Whether they chose this life or whether this life was thrust upon them, they are content for the most part. And they don't know how to change. And they recognize that the world around them is changing, but they can't. So they're going to live their lives the best way they can until the final moments. This Wild Bunch are alive and well and on the move, and they are not in a good mood. They have something to do at the end of this film which will define them. Will they succeed? Will they be able to survive the changing world that is happening around them? Or will the curtain fall on them at the same time that it's falling on the Wild West? So saddle up, let's go, and see what happens from the 22nd row.